Our main job duty is to run the heart-lung bypass machine during cardiac surgery. We do other ancillary jobs with blood management, other ECLS jobs, BAD, balloon pump monitoring, and of course ECHMO, the reason why we're here. All right, so what is ECHMO? ECHMO is every perfusionist's favorite four-letter word. ECHMO stands for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. You'll sometimes hear it called ECLS. Basically, the definition of what ECHMO is a treatment that uses a man-made heart and lung to support the body when a person's own organs are too sick to do the job. ECHMO can be used to support the body for a long period of time, from hours to days to, I've even seen, months, which just allows the heart and or lungs to rest. This is important. ECHMO itself doesn't heal the patient. It just gives them time to recover if the traditional treatments have all been tried. That's very important. So searching the internet, I just kind of found some old school pictures. I guess that top picture is the first attempt at what is now called ECHMO from 1971, and you can see as tubing, lots going on there, and we progressed through the years to a small technology is advanced like anything. I'm sure in 10 years it'll even be smaller. So this is a typical ECHMO circuit. I chose this picture. Of course, there's many different name brands, types, etc., but that is what our circuit is supposed to represent. That consists of the machine, sterile circuit, the oxygenator, which I'll go over in further detail, the heart, and the sterile tubing. Okay, the oxygenator. The oxygenator is the most important part of the circuit. This is where technology has really taken off over the last couple of years. They're much more efficient and last much longer than they used to.
Okay, I'm talking to it just a little bit better.
That is the lung of the patient. So how does the oxygenator work? So basically oxygen transfer in the membrane is determined by the oxygenators and limited by the geometry, the size, the membrane thickness, what FiO2 you're running, the patient's hemoglobin, your sweep flow rate, and the blood flow rate. CO2 is eliminated by controlling basically the sweep rate, the countercurrent gas flow through the oxygenator. So in the oxygenator, the blood flow literally flows one way and the oxygen flows the other way. And oxygen is picked up and CO2 is blown off. So the ECHMO pump, the centrifugal pump, this is a picture of the pump we use. There's many different brands and whatnot, but this is essentially the heart, and that will provide the cardiac output for the patient. Flow is determined by the patient's size, BSA, their blood pressure, and O2 demands of how fast we flow. Flow can also be affected by cannula position and size. This centrifugal pump spins a certain RPM, which provides the laminar flow with blood throughout the circuit. That circuit is rated to flow between 6 to 8 liters per minute. And then you need a flow probe to determine how fast you're actually flowing. And a pro of a centrifugal pump is they can handle air very well, and they cause less red blood cell lysis. So that's the heart. So once again, how does ECHMO work? So ECHMO is essentially what we do every day in open heart surgery. But we use the pump to take over the work of the heart, and an oxygenator, the lung, take over the work of the lungs. So first, 1 or 2 cannulas, possibly more, which are large tubes placed in arteries or veins, are placed in the patient's heart, neck, and or groins. Based on the patient's indications, which I'll go over later, the ECHMO team will decide what type of ECHMO, which I'll go over in a little bit, and the number of cannulas needed and where they will be placed. So with the use of cannulas, which are like really large IVs that allow blood to be taken out of the body and pushed through the ECMO system to the tubing back into the body. I just included a brief picture. There's hundreds of different types of cannulas depending on the patient's size, where they're going in the body. There's just a couple of pics. So just for your reference, I included some pictures of where you can be cannulated, and just so you guys can see the size of these. These are not IVs. These are big cannulas. So this is fem-fem cannulation. This is neck jugular cannulation. You can also cannulate in the carotid artery. That's typically done in pediatrics or infants. And this is central cannulation. You can see this patient has had a sternotomy, probably post-cardiotomy from an open heart case in which we were unable to wean, and they just used the existing cannulas in the heart to transfer over to ECMO. All right, so the two different types of ECMO. So when somebody's on ECMO, you always, as a perfusionist, you want to know, well, what type are we on? Are we on VA ECMO, venous arterial, or VV ECMO, venous-venous? So when would you go on VA ECMO? So VA ECMO provides support for the patient's heart and lungs by allowing most of the patient's blood to move through the circuit without actually going through the patient's heart. VA ECMO takes blood out of a large vein and returns it into a large artery, allowing the oxygen-rich blood to circulate through the body even if the heart is too weak to pump it. Essentially, the blood will bypass both the heart and lungs. So, the indications, I'm not going to read all these, but when would you use VA ECMO? Basically it comes down to is when you have a sick heart. All the reasons why you might have severe cardiac failure. I highlighted in red there, probably when we would use it the most here at MCR, it would be a post-cardiotomy fail. We would be unable to get off bypass in the open heart room. And a bunch of other indicators there. All right, so VV ECMO. What's the difference? So VV ECMO is support, and it only provides lung support only. So the patient heart must still function well enough to meet the body's needs. Typically 2 or more cannulas are placed in veins and spots close to inside the heart. Take the blood out of the patient, and then the oxygenated blood from the ECMO system will be returned to the body before the heart, and then the patient's own heart will pump that oxygenated blood throughout the body. And it essentially allows the lungs to rest. So when do you use VV? VV really took off, especially in adults, around 2008, 2009 with the swine flu epidemic. And it's predominantly used just in situations of ARDS. In my experience, we really used it a bridge to transplant. They were waiting for lungs, and their last resort was to be put on VV ECMO before they got their lungs. Okay, ECMO can also be used in near-drowning patients with either cardiac or pulmonary failure. We've had a few of these here in Northern Colorado recently. It's patient-dependent, either VV or VA can be used. The ECMO circuit, on the bottom of the oxygenator, there's the ability to hook up water lines, and we can use water to either heat or cool the patient's own blood to warm up their core temperature. And in this case would be, if it was a drowning or a cold victim, warm them up. It's basically just another, we can provide respiratory or circulatory support versus continuous CPR, and just in helping the aid of resuscitation of that patient.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's the difference in your rate of reforming with ECMO versus bypass? So you have a profoundly hypothermic patient. Is there any difference between the two? They're about the same?
It's the same. It just determines on our ability to flow, which should be the same in either instance.
So would there be any advantage to doing ECMO versus bypass hypothermic patients?
Um,
You know, like just, would one be easier than the other, or what would be the decision making that would go into bypass versus ECMO for a hypothermia patient?
it would be the surgeon discretion,
Okay.
just depending on the injuries, patient size, what's going on, where they want to cannulate, type thing. Yeah, it basically comes down to surgeon preference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of in that same vein, if, say, a crew's bringing in a drowning patient or hypothermic patient, how long does it take? I mean, would you guys come down in the ED bedside and do it there, or they have to go to the OR to kind of get things going?
That would typically, for something like this, we'd like to go to the OR. That would be the open heart team's call.
Yeah,
It's be surgeon preference, and I mean, in ECMO centers, that would be, we're not an ECMO center, we're essentially, I know we're, you know, as far as ECMO is concerned, we're just a community hospital. We support we're not a place where a patient really should be transferred for ECMO. We do not have the ancillary support here outside of the OR to support our patients. So in this center, something more regional would be in the OR.
Yeah, we don't do it enough, basically.
Right.
Yeah, the team is not, I mean, it's something that we can handle, but it's much more than us to do that as far as getting all the surgical supplies down there, the surgeons, how they're going to open. It's just not feasible here the way it's set up.
About patient size, we'd always heard about 40 kilos, you know, for our pediatric indications. What would
We are
be
in an adult center, so yeah, 40 is probably a good reasonable number because we just do not have the smaller cannulas to work with pediatrics or children,
That's what
unfortunately.
our protocol says 40. If they're less than 40, go to children's.
Which makes sense.
40 and above are an adult, but I guess you can have.
Yeah, we
adult
have.
Weigh right around 40 kilos.
Yeah, we sometimes do.
And even small little ladies, you know, we don't have sometimes cannulas small enough to accommodate long-term ECMO.
Okay. All right, so ECMO contraindications. This is important. It's kind of an ethical back and forth because, you know, technically anybody coding or near death could be put on ECMO to prolong their life. So ECMO is appropriate as a support mechanism in patients with reversible conditions. And remember, it does not treat the underlying condition and is therefore acceptable only if the underlying pathology is reversible. So more indications, I'm not going to read all of them, there's absolute and relative. And this is tough too, because if it's an emergency situation you're coming into, a lot of times you don't know all these. And we don't make that call, fortunately, but it can be tough. All right, so what can go wrong with ECMO? Well, bluntly, a lot can go wrong, but generally, ECMO inserted for VV has less complications than VA. And that only makes sense because, you know, the venous side is low pressure versus VA, the high pressure side, and they're much more sick patients. With VV patients, typically they're wide awake. They can sit up. They can even be mobile. We transferred patients on ECMO. They're in their walker, and we walk behind them with this machine. But bleeding is the number one issue associated with ECMO, which makes sense related to the surgical insertion of large cannulas, being on our machine, factor consumption, being introduced to the foreign body, and due to the fact that we need to be anticoagulated to be on ECMO, either through heparin or Angiomax. We like to run our ACTs about 150 to 200 or a PTT of 60 to 80. We do not want to clot off our circuit. In addition to that, with clots, the microair, neurological issues, can happen. Of course, infection, you have all these cannula insertion sites, the blood leaving the body, lead to other organ failures. And then the mechanical issues of where we come in, the ECHMO team, to sit there and watch circuit clots, kinks, cracks, cannula displacement when you're moving people. That is why when somebody's on ECHMO, it's watched 24/7. We have somebody monitoring it all the time, because that's, something goes wrong, it usually goes wrong fast. And somebody needs to know how to operate this machine. All right, so ECHMO transport, I just pulled a random picture. Yeah, you guys got that one right in Germany. It's amazing when you go just doing random searches on ECHMO transport. It's become so prevalent. I guess I hadn't educated myself on it. There's literally companies out there that do this for a living. There's great YouTube stories about patients being transferred on ECHMO across the United States, from Europe to the States, from Japan to the States, mainly people in the armed forces. But you know, kind of like, wow, really great stories of how they do this, and you know, they can do that. Hopefully, we can get them down I-25 an hour. So.
That's Dr. Hutchison with the white polo shirt and the man sandals on.
Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to ECHMO transportation, as a guide, I use, it's called ELSO. It's kind of the ECHMO organization that has guides, and it's kind of our go-to as perfusionists. I sent the packet. They have a recommendations, requirements thing somebody wrote up. I sent it to Nate. I don't know if Nate's
He's not
here.
even here.
Okay. I didn't include all that. I just tried to include kind of what was pertinent to our situation, and as perfusionists, because really I don't know how to do your guys' job. You know, it's going to kind of be a team effort, so I didn't want to tell you what they recommend, this is how you do it type thing. I just want to point out what we will do. So they consider what we would do a secondary transport, which the person is already on ECHMO from the referring facility and needs to be transported to another facility, which in this case would be Metro. And why Metro? Metro has an ECHMO program. They probably have a person on ECHMO almost every single day of the year, if not multiple people on ECHMO. They have a team, they have the staff, the equipment, and they're in their brother hospital in the system. So it's probably in everybody's best interest if the patient is stable enough to transfer them down to Metro.
Who does their transports? You know?
Last time you did.
Yeah, you guys did.
Yeah, well, we've only done one.
Well, that's all we've had.
That's all we've had.
Oh, okay. So they must not do a lot of transports.
We
into
don't do a
Metro.
lot of ECMOs. That's the only
Not here.
ECMO we've done here in 5 years that has been in the ICU. So it's not something that we encounter
'Cause I
often
think,
here.
Does Life for Life do them?
Airlife never will do them, but I think they do them because they do them, not because they're trained to them. But again, they're probably taking a perfusionist with them.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
A perfusionist.
Mark and I had lunch a couple weeks back, and medevac did 2 of them back to back, like 2 days in a row. And it was the same thing for them. It was like they called around and do them, you do them, and no one really does them. And so they're like, well, then what do we need to do it? And they're like, we need a perfusionist. Well, congratulations, you're going with us. And so, again, these tend to be transports. If you don't transport them, they're going to die. So you've got no choice but to welcome aboard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the university, I haven't been there in 3 years, but they routinely receive patients from outlying hospitals.
That's what you mean by Metro?
Yeah,
University
sorry.
Central.
Yeah. Central Metro. Changed. Okay, so pertaining to us perfusionists or the ECMO specialists, which would be us, they recommend we would be responsible for ensuring all the ECMO equipment is functional and loaded at the time of departure. We prepare the transport ECMO upon team's arrival at the referring hospital. We just basically get everything ready. We know what we have to do. We want to make sure we have everything lined up because we can't be halfway down I-25 and realize we forgot something and turn back around. And then once we're on the transfer or in the ambulance or whatever device, we are responsible for the management of ECMO. That's why we are there. You guys don't have to worry about learning about ECMO.
We're gonna use ground or air?
Ground.
Yeah. That's what I expected.
If you need to stop at 7-Eleven and get some saline or something like that, or blood.
Yeah.
So they go through a list of obviously the equipment that we would need. The pump is the first couple lines. Devices for heating and regulating the circuit blood temperature. We have a heater cooler. We didn't take that last time. It's such a short trip that we probably wouldn't need that. But medical gas, tanks, hoses, connectors, flow meters, blenders, possible splitters. If there's not enough accessible ports in an ambulance for the O2 lines. Point of care, which would be an ISTAT in this situation. Emergency pump or a manual mechanism in the event of a pump failure. We have this thing, and it's literally, this is where the heart goes, and if we have failure, we crank.
It's not
And you
easy.
just hope you didn't put the IV pole ever so slightly off.
Yeah, this. And then the interruptible power capable, that's basically making sure that these machines have batteries, make sure the battery's charged, working, in between the facility and the ambulance. And make sure we have blood and fluids in case of a traumatic injury to the patient, cannula gets pulled out, or something cracks or breaks on the circuit.
How much blood do you take
Yeah.
to replace what's in the circuit? Like how much do you know?
We wouldn't take what would replace the circuit. It would just be to keep the patient, all these ECMO circuits are afterload, preload dependent, so we have to have, the patient has to have a normal CVP or we can't flow. So if the patient is actively bleeding, we may be squeezing blood in all the way there. I think last time we went, we took a relatively big blot, a lot of blood, a lot of FFP platelets. I don't know if we took cryo, I can't remember, but
Yeah.
we had a pretty good, we probably had what?
4 or 6.
I think
units.
6 units of
Yeah.
pack cells and
Mm-hmm.
a couple of platelets and FFP.
I mean, how much volume does it take in blood to prime that circuit, though?
That liter
Yeah.
bag
Yep.
right there
So-
primed the whole circuit and that's what's left. So,
800-ish.
so it's small,
Yeah, it's small.
900 to prime the
whole thing, but then some of it will get cut out
Yeah,
as
give
well.
or take
Yeah.
a couple
Yeah.
100 mLs.
Yeah.
So, and then it went off on ambulance considerations, and this is not my forte, obviously, but in addition to ACLS and safety requirements, they talk about adequate internal space and load capacity. I don't know if you guys have a small version of ambulance and a bigger one. Obviously, bring the bigger one would help. An independent oxygen source in case, obviously preserve the portable air tanks in between transfer between hospital and the ambulance. And this is the big one, adequate power source to sustain all electrical components during the transfer. That's a big one. And then special consideration for safe patient loading and unloading. Just make sure we have enough help. You have a lot going on. You have the additional 60 to 80 pound machine that's going to be added to the top of the patient. And there's a lot of stuff going on just to make sure nothing gets kinked or pulled or broke on the circuit. And it mentions, potential complications. If you're in the ambulance, obviously the sudden vertical or horizontal movement, altering the patient position. Like Monica was saying, the patients are preload dependent, so sometimes, you move the patient, we were unable to flow, the blood shifts, a cannula gets moved up against the artery or vein, sucks down, the tip gets stuck. And then the big things, with the lines, these lines are 6-7 feet, depending on where they're cannulated, and they're pliable, so at any time the circuit can get kinked. And if that's keeping the patient alive, that will affect the blood flow, and then obviously the patient could deteriorate very fast. And probably the biggest one as a perfusionist is just we don't want to pull the cannulas out. That's the biggest thing. Everybody be on board, watch the cannulas, don't pull those suckers out or we're going to have a problem. And then I found this on the internet, just kind of, it was a study in the journal Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. They kind of went through, because there's not many studies on what goes wrong, and they found 536, and they found records from 516 of them, and about a third of them, what they called an adverse event occurred. Luckily, nobody died. 65% of the complications were patient-related. Most common loss was loss of tidal volume, and then the rest were a staff-related flaw, basically equipment, technical. In my experience in talking to other perfusionists who do that, the biggest thing they've seen is the malfunction of the ambulance utility or electrical. I don't know if that's common or whatnot, but they've lost power. And then I guess the wrong size ambulance showing up, realizing, oh, we can't fit, type thing.
So I take it, does it last long on battery?
Maybe 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to, that's holding your breath.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
So-
technically, really, you could probably get from down to.
You could.
Big old giant
This is a picture. So you can see there's a lot going on. I wasn't here for this one, but it was Beth and Monica, but from all accounts, it went very smooth. It was a great team effort.
Yeah, you guys really were.
For us not really doing it before.
Rob standing right there, that's his feet.
So we did this in 233.
Yes.
This
In
was in February.
20 though, we
Yeah,
had
by
the
20.
old ambulance up the one we're in now, but I think we could do it in the one we're in now.
Well, but,
The med air is the one concern that we had.
yeah, can you, there's only one ambulance in the whole fleet, our old ambulance that we don't use routinely has medical air and oxygen.
So we have to have that.
Can you take other cylinders in the hospital that we can take it to make it?
And it's not recommended. I think it would be safer to keep the patient here and can't transfer them on tanks.
Then we need to look at.
So you just
having-
can't
So-
put a hose on, drive faster.
You're right.
pressure
So
unit,
example,
drive
what
there.
we would be taking is, maybe Kyle can show, but we will take this blender would have to go, and
During transfer, from the unit to the ambulance, we'd be on O2 tank. But preferably, once we get in the ambulance, we'd have the accessibility to plug in our O2 and mixed air.
You're still on tanks at that point. You're just on bigger tanks.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
And we need to make sure those tanks
Are
are full.
yeah.
That's gonna be like the important thing.
It sounds to me like we need somebody on our team to make sure that we've always got a rig that's capable of doing this.
Not in,
Medical air.
not in.
On it.
And amperage requirements, any problems there?
We didn't have any problems with ours, we left the generators that.
I mean, I think that guy was on what, four
We do have
four
amperage
trips?
requirements, so for
For
that.
Vents.
yeah.
That is, they need the second
Water.
circuit.
Yeah.
Nick had a generator dying again?